Okay, this is chapter 8 of The Night Singer. 8. Hannah fumbled for the steering wheel, gripping it so hard that her hands began to ache. It was almost 16 years since she had last seen Rebecca, and she had no trouble recognizing her from her driver's license. Any wrinkles she might have were barely visible, her age primarily evident in the solemn look on her face. What Hannah remembered most clearly about Rebecca was her laugh. She had been Hannah's one real friend throughout childhood, though her surname had been Carlson back then. None of what happened was Rebecca's fault, but she would forever be bound up with it. Hannah's surroundings came back to her, but she still didn't feel ready to drive. She was glad she hadn't looked at the information while she was still with Ove, because there was no way she would have been able to hide her reaction from him. Perhaps she should call him now and let him know anyway, toning down how close she and Rebecca had once been. No, she didn't want to risk being taken off the investigation. Rebecca had always been there for Hannah, and now Hannah wanted to do the same for her. She wanted to try to pay back some of that debt. She turned the ignition and drove over to the guest house. Pulling up outside, she shut off the engine and stared down at the copy of Rebecca's license on the passenger seat. As she put it away, she realized that she still hadn't set up her work phone. She switched it on, logged in, and changed her password, dropping it into her pocket and climbing out of the car. Hannah stepped into the yellow wooden building, passing the various small rooms inside. There were chairs everywhere, wooden chairs with striped cushions, wicker chairs, armchairs, but they were all empty. At the rear of the house, she found a bar counter. A woman appeared behind it, giving Hannah a questioning look. "I'm looking for my colleague," she told her. "If he's with the police, he's out in the garden." Hannah found Eric on a white wooden chair enjoying a sandwich with his face raised to the sun. "Decided to take an early lunch," he explained. "You eaten?" Hannah nodded and sat down beside him. Her only connection to Vickelby was that she had once been to a party there thrown by one of Rebecca's friends. Christopher had been there too. All she remembered was throwing up behind a bush and spilling wine on a sofa. That and the fact that the parents, who were supposed to be in Spain, had come home early and screamed at everyone to leave. It was a month or so before she graduated from high school. The sofa and the stereo had been ruined and everyone's parents had been called. She remembered wishing that Lars would shout at her, but of course he didn't, even though she was the one who had spilled the wine and should really have paid for the damage. That was one of the few times she had complained about them never having any money. Was that why he had decided to break into the house? There are consequences to everything we say and do. "How was your meeting?" Eric asked, his mouth still full. "Great," she said with so much enthusiasm that she hoped he wouldn't ask any follow-up questions. He didn't. Instead, he brought her up to date with what the Bushners had told him. "We need to find that man on the bike," said Hannah. "Absolutely, and the owner of the car parked in the rest area." The car owner would be much easier to find than the cyclist, Hannah thought to herself. "They've identified the body," she said. "Already?" "Yes, we have to go and break the news to his mother." Hannah kept her face neutral as she spoke. "How old was he?" asked Eric. 15, would have been 16 in December. "Older than I thought." "Yeah." As though it would have made any difference if the boy was a few years younger. Rebecca's son. Hannah felt her eyelids twitch. 15 was far too young to be dead. Joel hadn't even started senior high school yet. He likely had other plans for the future than ending up dead behind a wall. Right then she realized something else, and it shocked her. If Joel was 15, Rebecca must have been pregnant during that awful week at the end of high school. Why hadn't she said anything? "Do you find it hard?" Eric asked. "What?" "Delivering news of death." Hannah nodded, pretending that was what was bothering her. Maybe she should tell Eric at the very least. Rebecca would recognize her. The last time they saw one another was on a Sunday, a week or so after they graduated from high school. They had sprawled on Rebecca's sofa, eating ice cream and watching Friends on TV. Just a few hours later, Hannah had boarded the bus to Stockholm. "Why didn't you say anything?" The anger and disappointment Rebecca had spat out a few days later when Hannah called her still hurt. But she had shared her plans in advance. She never would have left. Hannah got up. "Shall we go?" Eric moved the last of his sandwich into his mouth and shoved the last of his sandwich into his mouth and followed her to the car. Hannah knew where Rebecca lived, so she decided to drive, taking the southern road via Resmo, because it was a slightly longer route. It would give her more time to prepare. Eric managed to stay quiet for a few minutes. You got kids? He asked. Please stop talking, Hannah wanted to tell him. She needed the silence now, but instead she simply shook her head. Her last boyfriend, Fabian, was 7 years older than her, and she had felt his longing for kids like he was constantly breathing down her neck. After they'd been together for 3 months, he had asked her to move in with him in his suburban row house. Hannah drove through the Alvar, past the rest area where Joel's body had been found. The forensics technicians were still processing the scene, trudging around the barren plain in their white overalls. They had finally put up their tent. Was Joel inside, or had they already moved him? The haze was gone, and with the windshield as protection, there was no longer anything threatening about the landscape. I've got a 7-year-old daughter, Eric went on. Nyla. Nice name, said Hannah. Is it Sami? Indian. It means moon in Marathi and Tamil and probably a whole bunch of other languages. Eric was likely expecting a follow-up question, but Hannah didn't have the energy to be nice. It felt like she had already missed her chance to make a good first impression. As she turned off toward Garby, she felt a tug of anxiety in her chest. I'm married to an Indian woman, Eric explained. Okay. Hannah chewed her lower lip. She realized that Eric might think she had a problem with what he had said, which only worsened her anxiety. I grew up here, she told him. That's where I went to school. Hannah nodded toward the yellow school building. She pictured the scene through his eyes, the straight village street surrounded by houses and trees, the fields beyond, the low stone walls, the clusters of mailboxes by the road, the space. Most of the buildings in Garby were residential. Both the gas station and the supermarket had closed down since Hannah had left, and several of the houses looked like they were on the verge of collapse, though many had recently been renovated. Hannah didn't point out her childhood home. A family with young children had bought it around Christmas, and they had already repainted the exterior walls. There was a swing set in the garden now, and the grass was strewn with brightly colored plastic toys. She wondered whether they knew who had lived there before them. What was it like growing up around here? Eric asked. Like anywhere else, I guess, she said. Good and bad. It had been good since she turned 12, when her mother was diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia. She had died just a few weeks later, and life after that had been bad, eventually becoming impossible. Still, there had been 2 bright points, Rebecca and her grandmother. Thanks for the exhaustive answer, Eric said with a laugh. Where did you grow up? Hannah asked, her tone curt. Malmo. Hannah drove to a burned-out garage, and her grip on the wheel tightened. Of all the things she had to deal with at work, fires were always the hardest. Her hands relaxed once they passed Garby's cafe and farm shop. The cafe looked to have undergone a complete transformation and now looked like every city dweller's dream of the countryside. Peel's Mechanics was still opposite, looking the same as it always had. Hannah pulled up outside the house. When she lived in Garby, it had been owned by a woman called Sonia. She didn't remember her surname, but it could easily have been Forsland or possibly something else. Either way, this was the house the children always used to first visit at Easter, begging for sweets. The red paint was flaking, and it was obvious that children now lived there, but still little else had changed. There was a pink plastic ball on the lawn. They walked up to the door, Hannah clutching her left forearm. She wanted to tear back the black material covering her tattoo of a nightingale, the bird that would help keep the darkness at bay. After her mother's death, her grandmother had given her a small wooden nightingale to keep by her bedroom window. She claimed that because nightingales sing at night, it would help Hannah with her nightmares, but her bad dreams hadn't gone anywhere. When she complained, her grandmother had stroked her cheek and said, I know those dreams are horrible, but they would be even worse without the bird. Those words had taken hold, and Hannah had kept the bird ever since. It was on the windowsill of her bedroom in Kelva now. The doorbell didn't work, so Hannah knocked instead, made an effort to empty her mind of everything other than what she was here to do. The door opened, and Rebecca was suddenly staring straight at her. Hannah had had long hair throughout childhood, but it was now short. Her fringe was the longest part, reaching just above her jawline. She was also heavier than she used to be. Rebecca blinked for a moment, but then her expression changed. Hannah, she cried, what are you doing here? Her eyes flitted over to the ID badge Eric was holding up, and the look of surprise on her face quickly turned to fear. The last day. It was just before 8 when Joel gets off the bus outside Stegson School in Morbalonga. A few steps, it's all he can manage. His throat contracts, his feet refusing to budge. Black spots seem to bounce toward the low red brick building. Someone laughs. Someone else is arguing in a shrill voice. A shove in the back followed by, "For fuck's sake, get out of the way." He moves forward mechanically. A few meters from the main door, he stops again. He can't handle school today, listening to all these teachers who think they get it. The only subject he enjoys is art, and he doesn't have art today. 6 months ago, Joel actually liked school. Maybe like isn't the right word, but he could bear it at least. Thought of it as a ticket to something else. As Joel turns around, he almost walks straight into the assistant principal. He mumbles an apology and hurries away. He can feel her eyes burning on his back, but she doesn't say anything to stop him. Fuck, life sucks right now. He is desperate for something other than this. The only problem is that he no longer knows what. Joel takes out his phone and sends a message to Nadine. "Can we hang out today?" She replies immediately, like always. "Sure. Coffee lunch?" Lunch is half a day away, and that half day feels even less manageable than school. Joel's fingers are trembling, making it hard to hit the right letters on his phone. "Can you meet any earlier?" This time, her message takes a moment to arrive. "Rather not miss any more school. How bad is it?" Tears begin streaming down his cheeks. Fuck, he hates being like this. He angrily rubs his face with the sleeve of his sweater. Being clingy isn't cool right now. Nadine is always there for him, and the last thing she needs is another dose of his problems. "I'll be okay, just say where and when." "Sure," says Nadine. "Sure," asks Nadine. "Then Kolzenka at 11:15. Joel replies with a clapping monkey emoji. What is he going to do until then? The hours are full of obstacles. The library in Kamar doesn't open until 10. He forgot to put a new sketchbook in his bag, and he's short on money. Joel heads down to the harbor. He usually likes watching the boats, dreaming of other places, imagining that life could be different. He follows the cobblestones down to the edge. The horizon makes him dizzy, so he stares down at the deep blue water instead. There is barely a ripple on the surface, and it feels so tempting just to take a step out, to vanish into its calm depths.